Okay, let's restart after this coffee break. We have the great pleasure to have with us online Professor Zahle. Is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bergen, and she's going to talk to us about reactivity and bias in qualitative research. So you have it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk, and I'm very sorry I couldn't be at Athens with you. It's like a wonderful program you have. I will be talking about reactivity and bias in qualitative research. So the starting point of my talk is what I take to be a commonplace view, namely that reactivity and bias are main threats to data quality in qualitative research, and that these threats are often so difficult to ward off that qualitative data tend to be of very poor quality. So in this talk, I want to oppose this commonplace view, and more precisely, I will try to convince you or argue that lack of reactivity, transparency, rather than reactivity as such, is the main threat to data quality in qualitative research, and also that bias, this is in line right with the commonplace view, is a main threat to data quality. And then I will argue that both these threats may often be averted because of characteristics of qualitative research practice. So, my aim in this talk, I think I should clarify, is first and foremost to convince proponents of the commonplace view and those who are generally skeptical about the use of qualitative research that their views are unfounded. It is often possible to avert the two main threats to qualitative data quality. I also hope and think that my paper is of great interest to practitioners of qualitative research and others who hold a more positive view of this form of research. I see my discussion as making explicit and laying out in a systematic manner how the main threats are actually handled in good qualitative research. I focus here on the handling of these threats during data collection, but I want to recognize that steps may also be taken prior to the onset of data collection, but I will not go into them here in this talk. So, here is how I'm going to proceed. I will first say something about what I understand by qualitative research. Then I will argue that it's lack of activity transparency rather than activity as such that constitutes a threat to data quality, and also show how this threat may often be avoided. And then I will explain the bias as a threat to data quality, and also show how this threat may be avoided. Okay, so I'm going to focus on two forms of qualitative research, namely participant observation and qualitative interview. In participant observation, the researcher participates over an extended period of life in the ways of life she studies while observing what goes on. And on that basis, she generates her field data her findings. In qualitative interviewing, the researcher asks questions to an interviewee while encouraging her to expand on her responses, to introduce her own concerns, to digress, to exhibit findings. Moreover, these interviews are relatively long. On that basis, the researcher will then generate interview data or interview reports. Now, there are a number of features of qualitative research practice that I would like to highlight, also because I'm going to, in a sense, mention them and stress their importance later on in this talk. First of all, qualitative research is mental. And by this I mean that in most decisions about data collection, including what data to collect, all these decisions are made during data collection rather than prior to its commencement. Moreover, the researcher has limited no control over what the research participants do and say while she collects data. And then finally, the researcher collects a large set of non-standardized data, so that is bits and pieces of data. Okay, so equipped with this characterization of qualitative research, let me now turn to the first threat to data quality in qualitative research, namely lack of reactivity transparency. The way I'm going to proceed, I will first explain what we should understand by reactivity, and then I will argue against the commonplace view that is not reactivity as such that constitutes a threat to data quality, but rather lack of reactivity transparency. So here is a fairly common understanding of reactivity that I will also make use of. According to it, reactivity in qualitative research occurs when a researcher collects data in a situation in which the ongoing research affects the research participants' behaviors in unintended ways. So for instance, consider an interviewee who does not disclose her views on some topic because the researcher is a woman. In this case, the fact that the researcher is a woman has an unintended effect on the interviewee's behavior, and so it's an example of reactivity. Or consider the situation in which the research participants divert from their routines whenever the researcher is around. In this case, the fact that the researcher is present has an unintended effect on the research participants' behaviors, and is once more than an example of reactivity. Now, the commonplace view on reactivity is that data are only telling about social life when, so that means telling about what people do and say independently of being studied, when the data are about situations with low reactivity. So this means that data about situations with reactivity are taken to be only informative about people's behaviors as affected by the ongoing research. So for this reason, the commonplace view has it that these data are unfit to serve as evidence for answers to research questions, because we typically want to answer questions about social life as it occurs independently of ongoing research. So bottom line is, for the commonplace view, reactivity is a threat to data quality. So in the next few slides, I'm going to post this view. I'm going to argue that data about situations with and without reactivity are typically informative about social life when the data are supplemented through reactivity as such. So here is the first situation. The researcher has collected some data and supplements the data with the true reactivity assumption that reactivity did not occur in the data collection situation. Of course, here data are informative about what would have been said and done if no research had taken place. So what I'm talking about here is of course a situation and the point where the commonplace view would agree. The important point to notice, however, is that the commonplace view holds that data are only informative about social life in this very situation. And I'm now going to point to a number of other situations in which data may also be informative about social life. So, consider first a situation in which a researcher has collected some data and supplements these data with the true reactivity assumption that reactivity occurred in the data collection situation, but some behaviors were not reactive. In this case, the data about the non-reactive behavior is informative about what would have been said and done if no research had taken place. So, here make observations of an informed consent visit of an elderly woman and her son. So the elderly woman and her son came to this place where they conducted the clinical trials to get some information about what was going to happen in the trial so that they could consent eventually, if they wanted to, of course, to being part, the woman being part of the trial. Now, Fisher supplemented the data about the observations of what happened at this visit with the assumption that, differently from the doctor, the woman and her son were not affected by the presence. So she took her data about their behavior as being informative about what they would also have said and done if she had not been present. Then there is the situation in which the researcher may supplement the data with true reactivity assumptions to the effect that some behavior was reactive and diverged in specified ways from the behavior that would otherwise have occurred. In this case, the data will be roughly informative about what would have been said and done if no research had taken place. So let me again illustrate this point with an example. This example too is from Fisher's study of the clinical trials industry, and this time she made the assumption that due to her presence, physicians and research staff were trying to be on their best, most PC behavior when talking about the trial participants. So in light of this assumption, right, Fisher's data were roughly informative about how the physicians and research staff would have talked about the trial participants if she had not been present, namely in less PC ways than what she was able to observe. And then there is the final situation. Here, the researcher has collected data, and she supplements them with the true reactivity assumption that some behavior was reactive and caused by a characteristic ascribed to the research situation. Here, the data may also be informative about what would have been said and done if no research had taken place, insofar as the characteristic might have been ascribed also in a situation with no research. So let me again explain this point by way of an example. This time, I take the example from a study by Bergen. She studied young offenders in secure care units, and as part of this, she conducted interviews with the young offenders about their plans for the future. And she made the assumption that they viewed her as a sort of representative of society, and that this influenced what they told her about their plans for the future. So they would tell her that now they would stop being engaged in crime, and they would get an education, and so on. Now, Bergen's data were roughly informative about what the young offenders would have said if no research had taken place, since they would likely have said the same to another representative of a society, such as a social worker or the staff at the secure care. Now, in light of these reflections, I think we should reassess reactivity. Data supplemented with true reactivity assumptions are typically informative about social life. And I shall say that when data are supplemented with these kinds of assumptions, then data are reactivity transparent, their reactivity is. This means that, contrary to what the commonplace people, reactivity as such is not a threat to data quality. Rather, data not being reactivity transparent is a main threat to data quality. So, if that is the case, how may we then, or how may researchers then, avert the threat of lack of reactivity transparency? I'm not going to argue that because of a characteristic of qualitative research practice, there is an obvious way in which a researcher may deal with the threat of the data not being reactivity transparent. So more precisely, because qualitative research is flexible, and this means that the researcher takes most of the decisions about data collection, including what data to collect, during the phase of data collection, then a researcher may from very early on during data collection put forward reactivity assumptions and collect data that confirm them. So, for example, consider again the assumption that during the informed consent visit, the elderly woman and her son were not affected by the researcher's presence. Data that might confirm this assumption could be that during the meeting, the woman and her son did not once look at or otherwise take notice of the researcher, and that the only focus during the meeting seemed to be whether the elderly woman might get better if she participated in the trial. Another illustration of this proposal we get by looking at the assumption that the young offenders view the researcher as a representative of society, and that this influenced what they told her about the events of the future. Here, data that might then support to this reactivity assumption might be that when the young offenders were just talking among themselves, they would say that they had completely different plans about the future than when they talked to the researcher, that they related similar plans as it into the research, to the staff at the secure care unit, that they often treated the researcher and the staff in similar ways, and so on. So, I believe that using this strategy that capitalizes on the fact that qualitative research is flexible, the threat of lack of reactivity transparency in qualitative research may often happen. So I've now talked about bias as a threat for data quality, lack of reactivity transparency as a threat for data quality, and how this threat may be averted. Let me now move on to look at bias as a threat for data quality. So there are, of course, a number of different ways in which to conceive of bias, both in philosophy and in the social sciences. I'm going to propose one way in which I think it's useful to conceive of bias in qualitative research, and then I will explain a little how to understand this proposal, and then motivate it by comparing it to some alternative conceptions of bias. So I propose that we should say that bias in qualitative research occurs when a researcher's commitments influence the data collection process such that the data set ends up lacking one or several key good-making features. Now, commitments should be taken very broadly to include a researcher's non-epistemic values, expectations, emotions, perspectives, and so on. The researcher may or may not be conscious of all these commitments. But in any case, when they exert an influence on her data collection such that the data set ends up lacking one or several key good-making features, then we should say that we have bias in qualitative research. Key good-making features are the features of the data set in virtue of which it is fit to serve as evidence for an answer to the research question. So it is these characteristics that the data set has that makes it the case that you can use the data set to answer your research question. So qualitative data set should have a number of good-making features to be thus fit to serve as evidence for an answer to a research question. But I'm just going to focus on two of these features here, and then explain the idea of bias in qualitative research by elaborating on these features. And these features are descriptive adequacy and values. So, one result in the dataset lacking the good-making feature of descriptive adequacy. And when this is the case, the data fail correctly to describe what transpired. Now, let me now give you some examples, one example of this. But before I do so, I should note that from now on, my examples will be 12 examples. And this is because I've simply not been able to find discussions in qualitative research, in the qualitative research literature, where researchers relate their biases and how they discover them. So it will be a little simplified this, but I hope that the points still will get across. So an example then of how a data set may end up lacking descriptive adequacy because of bias would be the case if a researcher has certain rote ideas about gender roles. And as a result, after a meeting where she participated as a participant observer, she wrongly describes the male participants as having come up with all the new ideas. Now, another way in which a researcher's commitments may result in the data set ending up lacking a good-making feature is when these commitments has a result that the data set ends up lacking evidence. In this case, the data set will fail to describe all the relevant types of activities, viewpoints, events, and so on needed to adequately answer the research question. So in other words, the researcher fails to have data that give her the full picture of what happens in the field, and as a result, she cannot give a complete answer to the research question. Now, an example of this phenomenon might be a situation in which a researcher is studying the reception of a new study program. And the researcher has a very positive view of this new study program, and as a result, she mainly invites the interviewees to talk about all the advantages of the program, and so she ends up with very few data about the criticisms of the program. So here she fails to get the full picture of how the new study program has been received, and her data set lacks balance. So, I think as these elaborations also illustrate, bias is the main threat to data quality, because when it occurs, a data set fails to have one or several good-making features. Now, let me briefly motivate why I think this way of thinking about bias in qualitative research is useful by comparing this conception with two alternative conceptions. So here's one alternative conception of bias in qualitative research. According to it, bias occurs when the researcher's non-epistemic values influence the data collection process. This is, of course, a standard philosophical conception that I've adapted to the case of qualitative research. It is a version, right, of the idea that bias occurs when non-epistemic values influence the research process. My account differs in two important ways from this standard philosophical conception. First of all, I hold that non-epistemic values and other commitments may cause bias. I think it makes sense to broaden up the notion in this way, since other commitments and non-epistemic values may of course cause trouble vis-a-vis the data set, and they should also be handled similarly to the trouble that non-epistemic values may cause. The other way in which my account differs from this one, that's worth noticing, is that I take it that non-epistemic values are only problematic when they result in a data set lacking the key good-making features. So this is based on the recognition that a researcher's non-epistemic values, emotional engagement, and so on need not necessarily be problematic. They may also make the researcher, say, cover or pursue data that she would not otherwise have thought about pursuing. This point, that non-epistemic values may have a legitimate and positive influence on data collection, is of course in line with recent philosophical discussions that also acknowledge that the influence of non-epistemic values is only sometimes problematic. So another alternative conception of bias that I think is quite common in social science combinations of bias is that when you have bias in qualitative research, then the data collection gives rise to false or distorted results or results that are negatively affected by the researcher's commitment and the like. Now, there is nothing wrong with these conceptions as such. It's just that it's much more useful to specify what happens to data when bias in data collection occurs. So my account specifies that the data collection gives rise to a data set lacking one or several key group-making features. By making this specification, I think it will be much easier to recognize, avoid, and check for bias, both for qualitative researchers, but also for the audience. So, if bias is specified in the manner I just proposed, then I'm now going to argue once more that because of characteristics of qualitative research practice, a researcher may use a number of strategies to avoid bias in qualitative research. First of all, and once more, qualitative research is flexible, and this means that the researcher makes a number of decisions about data collection, in fact, most decisions about data collection while she's collecting her data. Because qualitative research is flexible, a researcher may continuously adapt the data collection during data collection with the aim of ending up with a data set with the key good-making features. So, by actively and continuously adapting the data collection in this manner, right, then the researcher may prevent herself from just falling into bias in data collection because she is a bit careless or does not sufficiently pay attention to what characterizes a high-quality data set. The more important strategy, perhaps, is that because qualitative research is flexible, a researcher may also actively seek out and collect evidence that confirms or disconfirms that the data set has the key good-making features. So she may engage in this form of data validation. And furthermore, if she collects disconfirming evidence, then she may correct or adapt her data collection and also determine if this problem was caused by a commitment on her part so as to prevent its further excessive influence. So, to illustrate this last proposal, we turn again to the field notes that described a meeting, including a description, and it also, contained a description of the male participants as having come up with all the new ideas. Now, if a researcher wanted to test or check whether this description is descriptively adequate, whether this description is correct, then one thing she might do would be to ask research participants to comment on the notes, or she might simply ask them to describe the meaning, or she might also seek out conversations where the research participants discuss the meaning. In this way, she might succeed in generating disconfirming evidence that would disconfirm that the description is correct when it states that all the male participants came up with all the new ideas, and so she could disregard the data about these males coming up with all the new ideas, and she should also ask herself, so why did I general that cause this problem, so that she can watch out for the influence of these ideas in her further data collection. There are also other characteristics of qualitative research that may capitalize on when a researcher tries to avert the threat of bias. Qualitative research also involves limited control, so little or no control on the part of the researcher over what the research participants do and say during data collection. Moreover, the researcher collects very large amounts of bits and pieces of data. Now, because of these two features, the research is likely, or very well, at least stumble upon evidence indicating that the data set lacks or will end up lacking key good-making features. And so when she stumbles upon this evidence, right, she should rank the data collection and also determine if this problem was caused by a commitment on the part, so as to prevent its further excessive influence on the data collection. So let me give you an example of a situation of this sort. Imagine that the researcher is studying the new study program, and that during an interviewee completely unprompted starts to criticize the new study program at great length. This may cause the realization on the part of the researcher that actually she needs to make much more room for criticism in her interviews so as to avoid ending up in the data set that lacks balance, because it only encourages the research participants to describe the positive aspects of the new study program and not allows them to talk about the criticisms too. Furthermore, if this happens, the researcher should ask herself, so why did I make this mistake? And she may hopefully come to realize that it's because of the enthusiasm of the program, about the program, and so she should watch out for this enthusiasm influencing excessively her further data collection. So I think that using these strategies, capitalizing on the way qualitative research works in practice, the researcher may often avert the threat of bias in qualitative research. So this brings me to my conclusion. I have argued that in qualitative research, lack of reactivity, transparency, and bias, properly specified, are main threats to data quality. I've also argued that capitalizing on the characteristics of qualitative research practice, both these threats may often be averted. And this means that the threats provide no basis for holding that qualitative data tend to be of poor quality. So we should reject the commonplace view that bias and reactivity are main threats to data quality that typically result in the researcher ending up with data of quality. Now, I think this conclusion is interesting in relation to the question of data quality in qualitative research, a topic that has received very little attention in philosophy and science discussion. But I also think there is a more general conclusion or take-home message that can be drawn and that has relevance for discussions of data quality more generally. I have focused on how the handling of threats to data quality in qualitative research depends on the qualitative methods and how these methods work in practice. This means that we should expect the handling of these threats, other threats, to be very different in connection with other methods of data collection and their associated research practices. So, in other words, how threats to data quality are handled varies depending on the method of data collection and the associated research practice. Thank you so much.
So many thanks, Professor Zahle, for this talk. We have learned many things about qualitative research, and so we have plenty of time for a few questions. If you have questions, maybe it's better to come here so that, because otherwise I think you really can't hear you. Vaso,
Hello and thank you. I was wondering whether you have considered at all a recent trend. I don't know about quality research in particular, but for instance, in the case of history, I mean, historians, what we usually take to be a bias, they think it's an advantage in doing research. That is, I mean, a woman researcher can identify more with women issues and so give us a better result in comparison to some men conducting the research, or indigenous scholars, I mean, having a privileged position in conducting research. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. There is a question of how you define bias. And you may define bias in such a way that it becomes something positive about the research, or you may stick to the idea that bias is something negative. In a sense, I have tried to stick to the idea that we should define bias so that it captures something negative, something we want to avoid in research. But I have tried at the same time to leave room for a woman's perspective, especially in science. So I think that being a woman can both bring great insights, but it can also, be unfortunate because you oversee certain things and so on. So the way I've defined bias, there is room for a perspective influencing the data collection process, and it may be a very positive influence it has. It's just that sometimes it may also be a negative influence, and that's when it ends up resulting in poor data. So I am very sympathetic to your point. It's just, I think it's more useful in the general discussion to stick to bias being a negative phenomenon.
Okay,
but there is a
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So any other questions?
Hello, Julie, it's me, Kostis. Thanks for your talk. So I was wondering your assumptions or the strategy of improving quality of qualitative research, let's say, by making these reactivity assumptions. It seems to me to presuppose the ability to make some very reliable predictions about reactive behavior. And I was just asking myself how realistic that is, and how isn't so the assumptions, so to say, assume that the reactive behavior is systematic and so that you can sort of subtract it and reconstruct the signal by taking into account the reactivity. But isn't research subjects' behavior typically much more unpredictable and noisy? And so how often do these strategies really work?
Yeah. Thank you.
Back to my chair.
Yeah. That is, of course, a very good question. I think it's, I guess it's ultimately an empirical question, and I don't have the precise answer. if they were to tell her about their plans, these youngsters were to tell her about their plans. But of course, there may very well cases where this doesn't work, and we can't really make this kind of conclusion that they react in one situation, carries over to the next. But I think we can put this cases quite convincing, but I'm not sure I have a kind of general fix to solve this problem, unfortunately. But it's a good question. How to do that?
Yeah, are there any other questions?
Hi, Julie. Thanks a lot. That was a very illuminating talk. I've got a simple question that will be beyond a bit of your claim. So let's suppose that you have established the claim that the data collected in qualitative research are not of a poor quality. So do you want to make also a claim with respect, let's say, in comparison to quantitative research? So they are not of probably poor quality, but are they in principle of poorer quality than quantitative research, or how would you like to think about it? Thanks.
Yeah. I'm not sure how I can, what arguments I can present in paper, this one right here, but I don't see qualitative research or qualitative data as being necessarily of a poorer quality than quantitative data. I think that many of the threats, or most of the threats that you can make in regard to a point pertaining to qualitative research equally pertains to quantitative data. It's just that they occur in different places. So quantitative research can be extremely biased. It's just that you pack the bias into the questions in your questionnaire. And if you then use these questions, then you will get the student bias and you will get bias. And similarly with reactivity, research suggests that people do respond to being searched on and do respond to the order of the questions and so on in a questionnaire. So it seems that reactivity occurs in quantitative research too. Now, the way you handle the threats is very different, right? Because in the quantitative case, you need to do some studies that, on the basis of which you think you can rule out both bias and hopefully also reactivity, I guess. Whereas in qualitative research, this is not, well, you can take some steps prior to data collection, but most of the steps will be taken during the data collection, where you try to constantly test assumptions that, or in a sense, test whether your data are high quality, so as to rule out that your data are biased or that will not be under reactivity. So I think the threats are more or less the same. I think that the good making features of data largely carry, it's the same good making features for qualitative and quantitative data, though with some exceptions. Reactivity, for instance, you don't handle that threat. Similarly and so on, but you don't. It doesn't work just with the reactivity, since you want to avoid reactivity in quantitative research. So, bottom line, I don't see any reason in principle to think that qualitative data are of poor quality than quantitative ones. And but yeah, maybe so.
Any other question? We have time for the last one. I had a quick question, very general one. So are these cases of reactivity and bias entirely distinct, or is there some connection between them? I mean, is the case that, for example, in a context where there are more biases, the context also where reactivity can have a more important role, or do you think they are entirely different things?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think that bias, the source of bias, is really the researcher's commitments or convictions or whatever. So that is what gives rise to bias. Whereas reactivity is, that's a question of the research, which is changing their behavior in response to being researched. And so the two phenomena, they have nothing to do with each other. There are two different ways in which things can go wrong. So, or not go wrong, but two different ways in which the research may be affected and that we need to somehow take into account. And that's it. I mean, you can imagine there is an overlap in the sense that bias may result in you not making sure to check for reactivity. Because you are so convinced about a certain thing that you take it as natural that, oh, when the research participants say that, it's because they mean the same as me, and I have the right decision, instead of it being looking into the possibility that they might see differently.